The parashas at this time of the year, during the 3 weeks that we mourn the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, are linked to this time frame, not only because the parashas have a theme associated with Gadol, but also because they teach us about the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash. We're going to learn something very intriguing about one piece of the Beis Hamikdash and the tremendous lesson that it teaches us about the way in which we serve Hashem, particularly through tshuva. So, Duvas Eshtetin Shalom, and again, the parashas Matas Massei and Devarim, the Shalom points out with regards to the double parasha Matas Massei and the parasha of Devarim, as Tamid Cholim Bein HaMitzorim Kudava Beita, that they always fall during the 3 weeks of mourning the Beis Hamikdash because it's appropriate, suits the time. And then he goes into detail about how these parashas link to Bein HaMitzorim. For example, Massei, which is about moving from place to place, is symbolic of Galus, as an example. But again, it's time for Bein HaMitzorim. The Rebbe pointed out many times with regards to this time of the year, that this is a time of the year where our waiting and anticipating Mashiach has to be more intense than usual. That's one of the reasons why during this time it's special to learn the Gemara Midas, which talks about the structure and the design of the Beis Hamikdash, and the halachas of the Rambam's Hilchos Beis HaBechira, also the laws of the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because when we learn all these things, as the Nabi Yecheskel describes them, the various elements of the Beis Hamikdash, the entrances, the exits, its design, etc., the Medrash tells us that by learning about it, it's as if you participated in building the Beis Hamikdash. So this is the right time of the year to do just that. So therefore, it's verstandig. That also then makes it logical, as in the parashas Matas Massei and Devarim is mirum is nit no the avedas mitzat chuban abayis chulei. That in these parashas you must not only have symbolism about the mourning of this time of the year, like the Shalom points out, but in these parashas there have to be things that are associated with the concept of geula, of efrat v'shaychus bin abayis, and specifically the theme of geula linked to building the Beis Hamikdash. So we're going to find one part of something that's discussed in this week's parasha that leads us to this concept, and that is the habir von taten bekeshem mit dem pasuk the parasha seinu by our miklot. So there's an insight from the Rebbe's father, which we'll get to later in the Sikha, on a pasuk in this week's parasha, which is about the Arei Miklat, where if a person has to run to the Arei Miklat because they inadvertently killed somebody, the pasuk tells us v'yashav bo ad moisa Kohen Gadol, that they have to remain there until the Kohen Gadol passes away. So we're going to explore why the Kohen Gadol, what's the association specifically to the Kohen Gadol, and a whole conversation about Kohanim and Kohanim Gedolim specifically, and about the area of the Beis Hamikdash allocated for them. And in the second part of the Sikha, a little bit later, we'll see how this comes into an issue of halacha. So what's the issue of halacha? In Eshet Perek from Hilchos Beis HaBechira Paskin, the Rambam tells us right at the beginning of the halachas of the Beis Hamikdash, that you're not allowed to build into the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, including the Heichal, which is the epicenter of the Beis Hamikdash, and the Azara, the courtyard around it. You may not design anything where there is wood sticking out. Either you build with stone, or with bricks and mortar. The Raivad asks, how could you say that? There was a chamber for the Kohen Gadol which was made out of wood. As described in the Mishnah Midas, that one of the chambers in the Azara was called the chamber of wood. And that chamber was allocated for the Kohen Gadol. And that's where he would prepare for Yom Kippur. So how can you say that you don't build with any protruding wood when there's an entire chamber that's wooden? So, was lernen, as Lishka meint nicht, as the Lishke is gemacht geworden von Eitzim. So there are commentaries who say, well, when it's called Lishka Sa'etz in the Mishnah, does not necessarily mean that it was actually made out of wood, nor as the Welt Bloisongriff mit den Namen, but it was called the chamber of wood. It's a verschiedene time for various reasons, was given them, and they give various reasons. Like the Kesef Mishnah says, there was a period of time where they stored wood in that chamber, so therefore it became known as the chamber of wood. But the Rebbe says it's difficult to accept that explanation. So first of all, the answers that they present are not necessarily such convincing answers, but we're not going to get into that now. The big issue is Lishka Sa'etz b'Pashas meint as the Lishka is gemacht geworden von Eitz. The fact that it's called Lishkas Ha'etz, not Lishkas Ha'etzim, if it was called Lishkas Ha'etzim, then it would make sense. Chamber for storing wood. But Lishkas Ha'etz sounds like, the simple translation, chamber of wood, sounding like it's made out of wood. So how could the Rambam say that you're not allowed to have any wood protruding in the Beis HaMikdash, and then you have a chamber that's completely wooden? B'yer Shleimer. As Rambam gufat das bavorant bedir kleshainai. So the answer is the Rambam addressed this in a specific choice of language, where he said that you cannot build in such a way that the wood protrudes. So the Mefarshim point out what the Rambam's telling us is to have wood in the structure of the Beis HaMikdash is not forbidden. The only thing is, the only problem is if that wood is visible, if it's sticking outside of the wall or the structure that it's built into. Where the Rambam gets such a thing from? The Mokah for Rambam is from Masechta Rosh Hashanah. So the source for the Rambam is the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, where it brings the pasuk with the Torah. It quotes the pasuk in Melachim, which says clearly, that Shlomo HaMelech built the inner courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, which is Ezra's Kohanim, Ezra's Yisrael, basically the operational areas of Karbonos, the place where the Kohanim operated and the place where the Yisraelim used to come bring the Karbonos and watch what was going on. So how did he make it? Shlosha Turah Gazis, Turah Kroisis Arozim. Then he made it out of 3 layers of hewn stone and a layer of cedar wood. Well, the Gemara is Oktiruf. So the Gemara says, how could that be? So it says, that there was in fact wood in the structure, but the wood was hidden within the structure and was coated over with plaster. And that way, Shlomo HaMelech ensured that there was no protruding wood, and that would be exactly what the Rambam's view is as well. There can be wood in the structure as long as it's not visible on the outside. As the Lishkas Ha'etz is gemacht von Eitz, and then we could simply say that this chamber, identified as the wooden chamber, was in fact made out of wood. But there was no problem with it. It was designed in such a way that the wood was then coated with plaster so that there was no visible protrusions of wood. Sounds wonderful. So we've found a workaround. Question is, why do you need a workaround? It doesn't make sense. That only explains how you're permitted to have a chamber that's made out of wood if you're not supposed to have wood in the Beis HaMikdash. Coat the wood, keep it invisible, and that's acceptable. But we still need to understand why make it that the design is to have a chamber made out of wood. And then get around that issue by coating it on the outside with plaster. Why don't we just have this chamber built out of stone or out of brick like all the other chambers? So there's obviously something about wood that plays a role in this chamber. We have to work out what that is. The Tosfos Yom Tov is mevored the tam deruf. As das adrech with the Gemara is masber for was die Schoch is, seine gewinn ausgestellt in an Eufen, was hat gern gewinn a Tirchi, a Ser bavoidus Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim. So the Tosfos Yom Tov brings a very interesting perspective, where he says if you actually have a look at the design of the Beis HaMikdash, the various chambers are designed in such a way that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur really had to schlep up and down quite a bit from north to south. Back and forth between the various chambers. So the Tosfos Yom Tov says, why is that? And he explains, to keep the Kohen Gadol humble, that he shouldn't think he's a big deal, he's the Kohen Gadol, and so we make him schlep around a little bit just to keep him on his toes. And therefore the Tosfos Yom Tov says, similar kind of psychology is at play over here with the Kohen Gadol's chamber, that it's made out of wood, not out of stone, to keep the Kohen Gadol humble. But is a snikim bir maspik, so it's a beautiful explanation, it really is. But the Rebbe says it's still missing something, surely, because okay, we get it that you have to do something to ensure that the Kohen Gadol does not have an inflated ego because of his position. Fine. But it's aber nicht mistaber, as man so hat sein in dem was liegt euch schad Gadol, as nicht geht der boy. But why do you have to go to such an extreme that the entire structure of the chamber he's going to spend time in is so obviously different to all the other structures? It's almost as if we're making a statement. We don't trust this man. We think he's going to become full of himself. So we have to create his entire environment to be a reminder of humility. That doesn't sound right. Remember the Mishnah in Yuma that said, that when they made the Kohen Gadol before starting service on Yom Kippur swear that he's not going to change any of the details of the service because they had to deal at that time with the tzedukim, etc. It says, The people who administered this warning, they then went aside and they cried over the fact that they in any way showed suspicion of the integrity of the Kohen Gadol. And now we're going to make an entire office for the Kohen Gadol that screams, we don't know if you're perhaps going to be egocentric. Befrat. So now, what are we saying? You've already made a whole thing on the day that he's running back and forth, so that's going to keep him humble. Plus, we spent a whole week before Yom Kippur separating him from everybody else, which Rashi says is also so that he doesn't get too full of himself. You're telling me that over and above all of that, that's not good enough to keep the Kohen Gadol humble. We have to design his chamber in such a way all year round, 365 days, in a particular way to keep him humble on that one day of Yom Kippur doesn't really sit well. So, to get a deeper understanding of why there is wood as a core element of the chamber of the Kohen Gadol, let's see what the Rebbe's father explains. So the Rebbe's father points out that the chamber where the Kohen Gadol would spend his time for Yom Kippur is also called, as we've noted, the wooden chamber. Why? Now, the truth is that name was only used in the good years of the Kohanim Gedolim, where they were righteous individuals, like Shimon HaTzadik. But after Shimon HaTzadik, which was an end of a very important period in Jewish history, after that, the end of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, etc. After that, the Kohanim Gedolim were not so reliable. Then they changed the name from the wooden chamber to the Parhedron chamber. Why? Because at that time, people bought their way into the position of the Kohen Gadol. And every 12 months, they had to replace the Kohen Gadol. Like this Parhedron, which was some kind of a position in the government to look after the marketplaces, where the person was relieved of his position on an annual basis. So Parhedron is actually not such a complimentary term. So the Rebbe's father explains a deeper perspective. First of all, the idea of wood, or specifically of a tree, represents longevity. Think about how long trees live for. But it's based really on a pasuk that my nation's days are like the days of a tree. In other words, forever. That would explain why when the Kohanim Gedolim were meant to be there, they were decent individuals, then the place that housed them was called the chamber of 8 of wood, to highlight the fact that they lived long, which in turn highlights the fact that they were righteous individuals. So it was a complementary name, Lishkasa 8. We'll get to the actual physical structure, but just the concept was that it is a complement to the Kohanim Gedolim. They deserve to be there, therefore they live through the year even after having been in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And the Noch is the Tata Mosif. Then the Rebbe's father notes that actually a Kohen, and specifically a Kohen Gadol, has a special relationship with longevity. Kohen Gadol shaykh l'yichus yamim. Kohen Gadol belongs in those who have a lifespan. Because the source of long life is from the right-hand side to the channel of Chesed, like the pasuk says, that length of days is in the right hand. What's the right hand? Bechinas Chesed, the channel of Chesed, was Kohen Gadol bechinas Chesed, and a Kohen, specifically Kohen Gadol, like Aaron Kohen Gadol, is an arbiter, is a representative of the channel of Chesed. So naturally, if this is somebody who's plugged into the channel of Chesed, and that's where long life comes from, a Kohen Gadol is somebody who is very much aligned with long life. Und bringt Haraya leze, as in Yonah from Kohen Gadol, for the Maimon Azam and Gea, hearing Nefesh Bishkoga, now tying it back to our parasha, the Rebbe's father links the Kohen Gadol, Chesed, and the energy of longevity back to our parasha about the person has to go to Larim Miklat. Was the din is, as must bleiben bir Miklatad, Moisa Kohen HaGadol, because as we've seen in our parasha, if a person inadvertently kills and has to go to the Arei Miklat, they have to remain there until the Kohen Gadol passes away. Why is that, says the Rebbe's father? Because a murderer obviously cuts a person's life. But Kohen Gadol, whereas the Kohen Gadol's entire being is to prolong life. So it doesn't make sense that a person who's responsible for cutting somebody's life should be in the presence of somebody whose entire dedication is to prolong life. So you have to wait until the Kohen Gadol passes away, and only then can the inadvertent murderer re-enter society. So the fact that the Rebbe's father adds this layer of detail, that the whole concept of long life is very intrinsic to a Kohen Gadol. That actually helps us understand not only why the name of the chamber of the Kohen Gadol is associated with eitz, which is longevity, but why the physical structure was made out of wood. Why? Das kommt nicht nur zum Rahmen sein mit dem Namen Eitz wegen die Befehl von die Kohanim Gedolim Shoy Tzadikim. The objective over here is not only to allude to the fact that the Kohanim Gedolim deserved to be in that position because they were righteous people and therefore they lived for a long period. Not so madgish sein as das in Yonshul Kohen Gadol b'chol hazmanim. The truth is, somehow by making the chamber out of wood, the message is that every time that there's a Kohen Gadol, or every Kohen Gadol at any time in history, is linked to this concept of longevity. Regardless of whether that particular Kohen Gadol lived long or did not. In the same way as the principle that a person is to remain in the Arei Miklat until the Kohen Gadol passes away, applies in all times. Even if the Kohen Gadol was not going to live very long, the law still remains the same. On the far is Lishkas Kohen Gadol gemacht geworden von Eitzim Dafka, which would explain why the structure of the Lishkas Kohen Gadol was specifically a structure that was made out of wood. Okay, we need to understand that better. So we need to understand this at a deeper level. If the whole concept of wood and a tree is so intrinsic to what a Kohen Gadol is, chesed and the flow and energy and long life, so then why did you cover the wood? The wood is supposed to be such a positive message and so intrinsic to what a Kohen Gadol is about. Now you make the chamber for the Kohen Gadol and you hide the wood with plaster as it's only its own boilet so it doesn't protrude. Why? Okay, you say because that's the halacha. And the din is so we know that the general rule of the Beis Hamikdash is that you may not have any protruding wood. But that's not arbitrary. Every single thing in the Beis Hamikdash is 100% precise and is expressive of a very deep meaning and content. So there's a reason why it has to be that you can't see wood in the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Wood seems like such a positive thing. We have to conclude that the fact that they then had to plaster over the wood is because that's the real meaning of the message of this wood. That even though the Kohen Gadol is all about long life, and therefore his place is Lishkas Ha'etz, for some spiritual, meaningful reason, that wood has to be hidden. We have to understand. Makes sense in the later period of the Kohanim Gedolim in the second Beis Hamikdash, where the Kohanim Gedolim were not so great. But the Kohanim Gedolim and they didn't live long. We understand at that point, you're going to cover over the wood, which represents the longevity, because because the idea of the Kohanim Gedolim living long is now hidden, because they're not living long. So, therefore, if their lifespan is hidden, makes sense that the wood that represents their lifespan should be hidden as well. But we'll still refer to it at least by the name. The name will be Lishkas Ha'etz. But why in the first Beis Hamikdash and the early period of the second Beis Hamikdash, where the Kohanim Gedolim were outstanding individuals who really deserved the whole concept of long life, etc., why then would you cover the wood of the Beis Hamikdash? Especially if you consider then at those times, the type of person who was a Kohen Gadol was the Holy of Holies. And by the way, even after Shimon HaTzadik, there were certain individuals who were Kohanim Gedolim of the highest order. And they lived for lengthy periods of time. Wasn't that every single Kohen Gadol was a rogue? So to get to understand that, we've got to go back to something else we quoted earlier, which was so we're told that after Shimon HaTzadik passed away, they changed the name of the chamber of the Kohen Gadol from Lishkas Ha'etz, the chamber of wood, to Lishkas Parhedron. What's Parhedron? So then was the Kohen Gadol haben sich jeden Jahr gebeten Parhedron alalu because Parhedron was a temporary position, and this represented the fact that at that point the Kohen Gadol were temporary positions because they'd go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur and they would not survive the year. So it's not gelatik. It doesn't really make sense. Ich noch das Mann von Shimon HaTzadik, seine gewinnt Kamer Kohen Gadol was seine gewinnt Tzadikim und haben Marich Yomim gewinnt al Kolponim mehr wie Yud Beis Chodesh. There were Kohanim Gadolim who were righteous Kohanim Gadolim even after Shimon HaTzadik, and many of them lived many years, at least more than 1 year. And perhaps one of the most controversial of them is Yochanan Kohen Gadol. But we have others as well. Various of the Tanoim, Rabbi Shmuel ben Pavi. There were various people who were Kohanim Gedolim and they survived. So the question then is, so why should we refer generically to all Kohanim Gedolim, including the decent ones, with the name Parhedron, which means temporary position? Which seems to highlight the negativity of the other Kohanim Gedolim. Who, because of their poor performance, they had to be replaced on an annual basis. So the easiest way to explain this would be based on something that the Rebbe explained previously, that the fact that they were being replaced on an annual basis is actually a compliment to them. Trotzdem, was sie haben gesehen, wie der friedige Kohen Gadol hat nicht Meisterschnosse given. Here you've got a Kohen Gadol who sees that last year's Kohen Gadol did not live out the year, because he obviously was not deserving to enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And yet this person, the next year, tries to get the position to become Kohen Gadol, and even pays money for it. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Surely the person identified his own spiritual lack. And knowing that he did not deserve to be the Kohen Gadol. And the best proof of that is, because he had to pay for the position, obviously implying that he doesn't deserve the position. So surely he knows that by entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim inappropriately, he's not going to live out the year. How could it be that he has such a passion to become a Kohen Gadol, which is effectively an extended suicide mission? Now the explanation that the Rebbe gave previously is that craving to be able to enter the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, to experience this exposure of the divine presence, is by given as a grace was such a compelling thought, as is by given kedai that they felt it was worth doing this, even if it meant not surviving the year. And that's why it was actually a positive thing to refer to the Kohen Gadol's chamber as the Lishkas Parhedron, even when the Kohanim Gedolim were as they should be, because because it actually highlights for us what a big deal it is to get into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. What an incredible achievement it is to be that person. How precious it is. Even if you only do it once. And even if it's going to come at the ultimate cost. Look how valuable that is. Parhedron reminds us, look how valuable even people who are not so righteous see that value and are willing to pay for that value. And when a Kohen Gadol, who is a decent Kohen Gadol, realizes how valuable it is to be able to have the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, then even if that Kohen Gadol has entered the Kodesh HaKadoshim more than once, as the Knisses or by him entire Punkt, blows them ein Mol, every single year he prepares to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where by sitting in Lishkas Parhedron, which is a reminder of what an extreme privilege it is to be able to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, what adds value to his experience, and that would explain why we call it Lishkas Parhedron, even for the good Kohanim Gedolim. It's a beautiful, beautiful insight, but doesn't answer our question fully. The fact of the matter is, Lishkas Parhedron reminds us the reality is there were inappropriate, ill-suited Kohanim Gedolim. On what basis do we dedicate a piece of the Beis HaMikdash by name to represent something negative about Jews? Not only that. Elishas Kohen Gadol is given Beker Bashtin, Vater Shivas Yomim, when men hat Mafish given the Kohen Gadol Prish Valley Legabe Ale Eden. When was this chamber used? primarily for 7 days of preparation to Yom Kippur, where we're trying to elevate the Kohen Gadol above everybody else. And that occurred during the days of Asesi Meitshuva. That is a time of the year, that's Asesi Meitshuva, where you're supposed to be extremely cautious not to say anything negative about a fellow Jew. As in from that this idea of Parhedron, this idea of replacing the individual every 12 months, besides the fact that it speaks to that they were ill-suited to the position and they still wanted it anyway, fundamentally, Parhedron as a concept must be a positive concept. Even though the simplest way to understand Parhedron is that it speaks about something really negative that applied to the majority of Kohanim in the second Beis HaMikdash, something associated with the fact that they did not live out the year. But those Kohanim who were on point, those Kohanim Gedolim who were at the level that they should be, they also had the element of Parhedron, and it was very positive. In other words, there's something about being different, that being switched out every year, that's actually really positive. The explanation is this. Let's first remember, what is a Kohen Gadol doing in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? The Nekuda von Avodas HaKohanim b'Yom Kippurim is Avodas HaTshuva. The primary focus of all of the Avodah that the Kohen Gadol did on Yom Kippur is Tshuva, obviously, because Yom Kippur is the day of Tshuva. Now, one of the Meilis in Avodas HaTshuva, the Avodas HaTzadikim, is there are two paths of how you could serve the Eibishter: the path of the Tzadik, the path of Tshuva. The advantage of the path of Tshuva includes that Vas Avodas HaTshuva is b'derech hischatshus, that when a person is engaged in Avodas HaTshuva, what they're doing is brand new, meaning Tzadikim do in fact consistently improve, increase, and elevate. As the pasuk says, they go from strength to strength. And as the Gemara tells us, in such a way that they never rest. So there's constant, consistent growth. But the nature of the growth is they go from stage to stage. With the power of whatever they achieved in the previous stage is how they're able to go to the next stage, even if the next step is a quantum leap. In other words, the tzaddik is jumping through hoops, next level. But the whole point of tshuva is that it's radical revolution. The whole purpose of tshuva is not that I build on what I was previously. That's what a tzaddik does, even if it's radical growth, even if it's quantum leaps. It's still building on who the tzaddik was previously. The Baal Tshuva, the whole point of tshuva is, I'm no longer who I was previously. To the extent that a person who does tshuva can, as the Rambam says, refer to himself as I'm not the person who did those things. I'm a completely different person. The ultimate state of that is chachos, of that complete renewal, reinventing ourselves completely, is the Kohen Gadol in the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur. Und davon bekommt jeder in dem Kerch zu übergehen. Min akotze la kotze beziehungen machen sich in a Metzias Chadosha legamrei. And thanks to the Kohen Gadol having that personal reinvention in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that empowers every single one of us to do something similar. Was das ist der Bir Pnim in den Din, as the B'Geloven Sheve Kohen Gadol beim B'Yom Matzei, einer Ever beim Pam Shnier Lo'olam. That gives us a deeper insight into the halacha that says the special white clothing which were reserved for the Kohen Gadol only for Yom Kippur, he doesn't use the following year. And an ignores him, but rather wherever he removes them, they are then put into a concealed place. As the pasuk says, you leave them there. You've got to think about that. Why? Torah doesn't like to waste. Why not use the same uniform from this Yom Kippur for next Yom Kippur? Like all the other parts of the Kohen Gadol's uniform, where the Torah does not mandate that after a certain time you may not use them anymore. Why dafka, the special white clothes of Yom Kippur, cannot be used the following year? Especially when you consider that these are special clothes, they're fancy clothes, as the Torah describes, clothes of beauty and of honor. Those usually last longer than other clothes. So why are you putting them away after single use? Now, there's Bozes Canal, there's a deep spiritual meaning behind this. That every time the Kohen Gadol enters the Kodesh HaKadoshim, through the avoid of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol completely reinvents every facet of his being. Even compared to the incredibly elevated status that he was last year in the Kohen Gadol, he's unrecognizable this year. He's a completely different person. It's not just that he's elevated a step higher or a whole echelon higher. No, he's completely replaced with a whole new being. Therefore, he needs new clothing, and can't wear the same uniform he wore last year because that would represent that he's still the person he was last year, which he's not. In them covered on Tiferes, especially because these clothes are supposed to add honor and beauty to the Kohen Gadol. Last year's clothing will be inadequate to give him the beauty and the honor that he deserves this year. Besides the fact, obviously, that the person is fundamentally different, so obviously the clothing that's going to give him that dignity is going to have to be fundamentally different. And this is the positive concept of Parhedron. In Gashim, some say Marich Yomim given. These Kohanim Gedolim were tzaddikim, they lived long. Aber Beruchnis is given as Machrifnes and Kol Shnei Moshe Chodesh, but spiritually, they were a brand new person every year. Durch the Knis and Kodesh HaKadoshim, by entering the Kodesh HaKadoshim and engaging in the avoid of Yom Kippur, they were a brand new person. It's not the same Kohen Gadol who was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim last year. Parhedron is a very positive message. It's like the person who's completely renewed every single year. The position is renewed. The Kohen Gadol is renewed. Dem Bira is verstandig, as der Teuchen for Parhedron mit das ist Maliusa is doing alles money. Now that we see the positive perspective of Parhedron, you can understand how that would apply at all times. Even in the first base, and even in the good period of the Bayis Sheni, when they were beautiful tzaddikim who were serving as Kohen Gadol and lived for many years, and yet they still had the Parhedron experience in its most healthy version. In Mishnah that also explains why Rabbi HaKadosh includes in the Mishnah both names for the chamber. In some places he refers to it as the wooden chamber, some places as Parhedron chamber. Because that represents the two facets of how the Kohen Gadol had to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. On the one hand, eitz bechinas chesed, was das dienen von avodas tzaddikim. On the one hand, a Kohen is a benish chesed, and this is the Kohen Gadol, so he's a tzaddik, so he's serving the Eibishter in the way of a tzaddik all the time. Plus, he has to have Parhedron, he also has to have the element of tshuva, which is represented by the Parhedron, the complete reinvention of self every single year. Shloimar Zosich Mat mit dem Bir von Taten in the word Parhedron. And by the way, this links to something that the Rebbe's father says later on in his explanation of this he's speaking about the various chambers in the Beis HaMikdash. So he says Parhedron is a name that represents din. So we've said that eitz is a name that represents chesed, and Parhedron is a name that represents dinim, which is obviously the concept of gevura. And he explains, for Parhedron is zunuf gestellt von drei Wörter. He says the reason is because Parhedron is actually three words rolled into one: par, har, and din. And each of those words represents din. Well, the third is obvious because din equals din. Par, he says, is related to what we call the gevuros of mansepach, which are as part of the vocalization of the mouth. There are different types of vocalization that a person uses depending on which part of the mouth that they're using in order to pronounce. So mansepach, which are the letters that have final letters in the aleph base, they represent din, the capacity to restrict. And har, a mountain, that he explains, is a symbol of incredible power. You can't move a mountain. That's why we have the cliche of moving mountains. So that represents din, something which is very firm and very specific, like a din is. Why is Parhedron associated with din? Because teshuva is not a chesed process, it's the contrary. It's a dinim, it's a self-judgment process, it's a discipline process, it needs a tremendous amount of strength kind of process. And one of the key elements of tshuva is to create very strict disciplines about how to behave in such a way that you don't regress into old, unhealthy behaviors. That is din. And generally, tshuva fits into this concept of pushing negative things away, which you're supposed to do with the left gevura part of the system. Part of tshuva is for a person to humble themselves or to denigrate themselves because of the things that they had done in the past, which separated them from Hashem. And to recognize all the darkness and the constraints that have been introduced into a person's life because of their behavior. So the whole avoid of tshuva is very much associated with din, with gevura, whereas the whole persona of the Kohen is associated with chesed. So the 8 represents the chesed, the avodas tzadikim version of the Kohen Gadol, and parhedron represents the gevura tshuva version of the Kohen Gadol, and both of them are relevant. And especially when you pay attention to the fact that the Rabbeinu HaKadosh used these two names in the Mishnah in different Masechtas. Lishkas ha'etz in Maseches Midas. In Maseches Midas, he calls it the chamber of wood. And the Shem Parhedron not the Gestalt in Maseches Yuma. It's only in Maseches Yuma that he refers to the same chamber as Parhedron. Why? Weil der Chilik zwischen die zwei Masechtes ist wie der Unterschied zwischen Avodas HaTzadikim und Avodas HaTeshuvah, because the whole content of Midas and the whole content of Yuma is like Tzadikim compared to Bali Tshuva. The Teuchim from Maseches Midas, the link between Midas and Tzadikim is wie the Tat is Mevoir, as the Rebbe's father explains, as Maseches Midas, Mari, Eichni, V'Abayis, Hasheni, B'Tchila. Maseches Midas is primarily how they designed and built the second Beis HaMikdash at the beginning of its story, of Tchilas Baysheni, Harei Hoyu Kohanim Tzadikim, at which time the Kohanim were Tzadikim. So Midas equals Tzadikim. And it seems that the Rebbe's father kind of kept this element simple and didn't spell out the following. Midas means measurement, which is the whole theme of that tractate, which represents how tzaddikim serve the Eibishter, where everything is measured, everything is calculated. Second of all, Chazal tell us who was the person who is responsible for putting together Masechta Midas, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Was Mishnasi is Kav Venoki, whose Mishnah is very precise. Again, the concept of a midah. And that's the avoid of tzadikim, where everything is clear and bright, and there's no darkness. And by the way, that's why you'll see in Maseches Midas, I think it's in Midas, or maybe it's in Tamid, where they bring the quotation from Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, where he says, I don't remember what Lishkas Parhedron is, because Lishkas Parhedron is not his paradigm. Massei Maseches Yuma is Teichna Avodas Yom Kippur Avodas HaTeshuvah, whereas Maseches Yuma is all about Tshuva and Yom Kippur. So there you use the name Parhedron, which is the name that represents Tshuva and Yom Kippur. All of that will help us understand why, despite the fact that the chamber of the Kohen Gadol was made out of wood, that wood had to be covered over with plaster. Because the primary objective of the Kohen Gadol at that time on Yom Kippur, which is what he's doing in that chamber, is preparing for Yom Kippur. That is not where he's doing Avodas HaTzadikim, not Tshuva. His primary focus there is Tshuva. That is not the time to represent the theme of the longevity of the Kohen Gadol associated with his intrinsic persona of Chesed, Erech Yomim B'Mino, but actually quite the opposite, that he's completely renewing and reinventing himself, which is a Tshuva kind of energy. Okay, so if this is not the time for the Kohen Gadol to operate at the 8th level, in other words, the Tzadikim level, how come the name Parhedron only came into play later on when the Kohanim Gedolim were actually not as good as they should have been? Because as long as the Kohanim Gedolim were tzadikim, the tzaddim was klal, the is given in adarga from tzadikim. And the reason that the Kohanim Gedolim was so great was because the people generally were as good as they should have been. So even at a time when the generation was really healthy, the Kohen Gadol still had to engage in avodas haTeshuvah on Yom Kippur. But what kind of teshuvah was it in those days? The kind of teshuvah that tzaddikim do. No, because the most subtle version of Teshuvah is not only Teshuvah because I did something wrong and I have to fix it, but Teshuvah is that my neshama entered this world, which is a place of lowliness, and I have to recreate closeness to Hashem. And the tzaddik also experiences that kind of tshuva. So there was a period in history where we call it parhedron because it's avodas hatshuva, knowing that the kind of tshuva that we're doing was a far more subtle and advanced level of tshuva than what we experience. But because tzaddikim never have to run away from the desolate valley, as the Alter Rebbe paraphrases in Tanya, therefore, the tshuva that they experience is not such an energized tshuva. It's not this thirsting tshuva, this deep yearning that a Baal tshuva has, which is completely beyond any calculation or any structures. My time is the Shem Lishkadan Lishkas Ha'etz, and therefore in those days they called it Lishkas Ha'etz because you don't see the power of tshuva which Parhedron represents. Specifically when it reached the period that the Kohen Gadol were not as good as they should have been. Which is symptomatic of the fact that the whole generation is not as they should be. Then the Kohen Gadol's work on Yom Kippur had to be to arouse people to literal tshuva. And it's specifically the kind of tshuva that radically breaks all the limitations to free a person to the extent that it makes the person completely new, that they invent themselves completely. Of course, that's the kind of tshuva that we need to do as well. And al-tili tshuva, l'al-tili gula, mitzvah Hashem, that will bring Mashiach now.